"Get a haircut. You look like trash." The words hit the hallway hard, loud enough that people near the ballroom doors turned to look. Victoria stood there in her red dress, her hand pressed against the wall like his cleaning cart had almost hit her. Marcus said nothing. He just looked at her, this woman mocking his uniform, his name tag, all of him, because he knew something she didn't. In 12 hours, she'd be sitting across from him in a meeting room, and he would own every floor of the building she was standing in. The Ashford Tower rose 52 stories above downtown, its glass facade catching the last orange light of a Chicago sunset. Tonight, the top 3 floors had been transformed into something out of a fever dream of wealth, the Hartwell Foundation's Winter Gala, an annual event where the city's richest families gathered to write checks to charities they'd never visit, wearing gowns that cost more than most people's rent. Marcus Webb pushed his cleaning cart down the service corridor on the 49th floor, the wheels squeaking against polished marble. He wore the gray uniform of Ashford Tower's maintenance staff, a name tag that simply said M. Webb pinned crookedly to his chest, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. At 51, he had the quiet, unremarkable look of a man who blended into backgrounds, which was exactly how he preferred it, especially tonight. Nobody at the gala knew that the tower itself, every steel beam and pane of glass, belonged to him. Marcus had built his fortune the hard way, starting with a small vac repair company at 23, then a construction firm, then a real estate holding company that quietly acquired distressed commercial properties across the Midwest. Ashford Tower had been his first major purchase, back when it was half empty and hemorrhaging money. Now it was the crown jewel of the city's skyline, worth north of $400 million, and it was his. But Marcus rarely told people that. He preferred to walk his properties the way a farmer walks his fields, quietly, in old boots, checking for rot before it spread. Once a month, he traded his tailored suits for a maintenance uniform and spent an evening moving through Ashford Tower unnoticed, listening to the hum of the building, watching how the staff were treated, learning things that never made it into quarterly reports. Tonight had started as one of those ordinary rounds. It would not end that way. The gala was in full swing when Marcus wheeled his cart past the ballroom's service entrance. Through the prop door, he could see the enormous space crystal chandeliers, a live orchestra, silver trays of champagne circulating on the arms of servers in white gloves. Women in gowns of emerald and sapphire drifted between conversations like exotic birds. Men in tuxedos laughed too loudly at each other's jokes about golf handicaps and stock portfolios. He wasn't there to mingle. A guest on the 49th floor had reported a flickering light in the east hallway restroom, and rather than send someone else, Marcus had decided to check it himself. It was a small thing. But small things, in his experience, were where the truth of a building and the people in it usually hid. He was halfway through replacing the bulb when he heard the click of heels against marble, followed by a voice pitched for an audience. "Oh, for God's sake. Watch where you're going." Marcus turned. A woman stood in the hallway, one hand braced dramatically against the wall as though she'd narrowly avoided a car crash rather than the edge of his cleaning cart, which was parked a good 3 feet from her. She was striking in the practiced way of someone who had spent a fortune ensuring it dark hair swept into an elegant twist. A crimson gown that clung in all the right places, diamonds at her throat that could have paid a year's salary for half the staff downstairs. Marcus recognized her immediately, though he doubted she'd ever laid eyes on him before. Victoria Sinclair-Hayes, wife of Preston Hayes, CEO of Hayes Capital Partners, one of the firms currently in talks to lease 3 floors of office space in Ashford Tower's East Wing. Marcus had reviewed the lease proposal himself just last week. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Marcus said evenly, stepping the cart back another foot. "Didn't mean to startle you." Victoria's eyes swept over him, the uniform, the cap, the name tag with the specific disdain of someone cataloging an inconvenience. You people are supposed to do this kind of work before events start, not during. Do you have any idea how many important people are here tonight? I do apologize, Marcus said. There was a report of a flickering light. Didn't want anyone getting hurt in the dark. Well, you're the one who's going to get someone hurt, blocking the hallway like this. She glanced toward the ballroom, where a small cluster of women in gowns had begun watching the exchange with the particular delight people reserve for someone else's public humiliation. Victoria straightened, apparently recognizing an audience when she saw one. "What's your name?" she asked, louder now. "Marcus, Marcus." She said it the way someone might repeat the name of a stray dog before shooing it away. "Marcus, I want you to understand something. This gala raised $12 million for children's hospitals last year. Do you understand the caliber of people in that room? And you're out here with your she gestured at the cart, at the mop, at all of him. Your bucket. Cluttering up the hallway like this is a strip mall." A ripple of laughter came from the small audience gathering near the ballroom doors. One of the women lifted her phone, clearly recording. Marcus felt the old familiar heat rise in his chest, not embarrassment, but something closer to recognition. He'd met 100 versions of Victoria Sinclair-Hayes over the years, people who mistook a uniform for a measure of a man's worth. People who had never once wondered who signed the checks that kept the lights on in the very buildings they swept through like queens. He could have told her. One sentence, and her face would have drained of all its color. "I own this building, Mrs. Hayes. Your husband's lease renewal is sitting on my desk. I decide whether Hayes Capital gets 3 more floors or gets shown the door." He didn't say it. Instead, he said, "I understand, ma'am. I'll clear the hallway." "See that you do," Victoria said, tossing her hair as she turned back toward the ballroom, savoring her small, easy victory. "And for God's sake, get a haircut. You look like you slept in that uniform." The laughter followed her through the doors. Marcus stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, the flickering bulb finally clicking to a steady glow above him. He looked at his own reflection in the dark window at the end of the corridor, tired eyes, gray at the temples. A man who owned more square footage in this city than Victoria Sinclair-Hayes' husband would earn in 3 lifetimes. Standing quietly humiliated by a woman who had no idea what she'd just done. He finished the light fixture. Then he wheeled his cart back toward the service elevator, pulled out his phone, and sent a short text to his executive assistant, Diane, who was home for the evening but always reachable. "Change of plans for tomorrow morning. Move up the Hayes Capital lease meeting. 9 a.m. I'll be attending in person." 3 dots appeared, then Diane's reply, "You never sit in on lease meetings. Everything okay?" Marcus typed back, "Everything's fine. Just want to meet the tenant properly." He put his phone away, and for the first time all evening, allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The gala rolled on without him, as galas do. Victoria enjoyed herself immensely for the next hour, retelling the story of the janitor to anyone who would listen, embellishing it slightly with each retelling until, by the time she reached her 3rd circle of acquaintances, the cleaning cart had nearly run her over, and the janitor had, in her account, practically threatened her. "You should report him," said Diane Castellano, no relation to Marcus's assistant, just an unfortunate coincidence of names, a woman married to a hedge fund manager who lived for gossip like this. Places like this are supposed to have standards. "Oh, I intend to," Victoria said, sipping her champagne. "Preston knows the building manager. I'll have a word." Preston Hayes, when he found his wife near the dessert table 20 minutes later, was only half listening, distracted by a conversation he'd just had with a man from the Ashford Tower leasing office about the timeline for finalizing their new lease. "Sounds like everything's on track," he told Victoria absently. They said someone from ownership wants to sit in on the final meeting tomorrow. Probably just a formality. Ownership, Victoria repeated. Uninterested. Fine, as long as they sign quickly. I want those floors renovated before spring. She had no idea, standing there in her crimson gown with a glass of champagne in one hand, that the man from ownership had spent the last hour being called clutter, a mess, and undeserving of a haircut, 3 floors above her head. The next morning, the Hayes Capital Partners conference room on the 47th floor was set for what Preston Hayes assumed would be a routine signing meeting. Coffee had been laid out. His legal team sat at one end of the long glass table, reviewing the final lease documents one more time. Preston himself sat at the head, checking his watch. Mildly annoyed that the meeting had been moved up an hour with no explanation beyond a curt email from the leasing office. Victoria arrived 10 minutes late, sunglasses still perched on her head despite being indoors, trailing the faint scent of expensive perfume and a hangover she was doing an excellent job of hiding. She'd insisted on coming not because she cared about commercial leases, but because Preston had mentioned there'd be pastries, and because she liked being seen at his meetings, liked the way his colleagues deferred to her as though her presence conferred some kind of blessing on the proceedings. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sliding into a chair beside her husband. "Traffic? They're not here yet either," Preston said. "Something about ownership wanting to sit in." "How thrilling," Victoria said flatly, reaching for a croissant. The door opened at exactly 9 o'clock. Diane Castellano, Marcus's assistant, not Victoria's gossiping acquaintance from the night before, entered first, followed by 2 members of the Ashford Tower legal team. And then, a beat later, Marcus Webb walked in. He wore a charcoal suit, tailored precisely to his frame, a crisp white shirt, no tie. His hair, the same hair Victoria had mocked the night before, was neatly combed, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed anyone's approval. He carried a leather folio under one arm and nothing else. No cart, no uniform, no name tag. Victoria's croissant stopped halfway to her mouth. "Good morning," Marcus said, taking the seat directly across from Preston and Victoria. His voice was the same voice from the hallway the night before, steady, unhurried, but something in the room shifted the moment he spoke, the way air pressure changes before a storm. "Marcus Webb. I'm the owner of Ashford Tower." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Preston's legal team straightened almost imperceptibly. Diane opened her laptop without being asked. And Victoria felt the blood drain from her face so completely that for a moment she thought she might actually be sick onto the conference table. "You," she said, before she could stop herself. Marcus looked at her for the first time since entering the room, and there was no anger in his expression, no triumph, nothing so simple as revenge. Just a calm, level recognition. "Mrs. Hayes, good to see you again. I hope the light in the East Hallway restroom held up through the rest of the evening." Preston's head swiveled toward his wife. "You two have met?" "Briefly," Marcus said, before Victoria could answer. "Last night, I was doing some maintenance work on the 49th floor. "Maintenance," Preston repeated slowly, looking between his wife's ashen face and the man now opening a leather folio at the head of the table. "I like to walk my properties from time to time," Marcus continued, unbothered, sliding a stack of documents toward Diane. "Uniform, cart, the whole thing. It's the only way to really understand how a building runs and how the people in it are treated." He paused, just long enough for the words to land fully. "Both the people who work here and the people who visit." Victoria's mouth opened and closed. There was no version of the sentence she'd rehearsed 100 times in her head last night, "Get a haircut, you look like clutter." You people that sounded survivable in this room, in this daylight, with this man sitting across from her in a suit that probably cost more than her gown. "Mr. Webb," Preston said carefully, sensing the ice under his feet without yet understanding its full shape, "I want to apologize for whatever there's no need to apologize on anyone's behalf." "Mr. Hayes," Marcus said smoothly, "I'm not here to relitigate a hallway conversation. I'm here because I have some questions about your lease terms, and because I make it a habit to meet tenants personally before I sign anything that puts them in my buildings for the next decade." He said it plainly, but everyone in the room understood the sentence beneath the sentence. "I have not yet decided if you deserve to be here." "Of course," Preston said. "Whatever you need." Marcus opened the folio, scanned the top page, and looked up not at Preston, but at Victoria. "Mrs. Hayes, may I ask you something?" Her throat had gone completely dry. "Yes," she managed. "Last night, you mentioned the caliber of people at your gala. $12 million for children's hospitals, if I recall." He said it without malice, almost gently, which somehow made it worse. "I happen to think that's a wonderful cause. My own foundation matched that donation, actually anonymously, through the Ashford Tower Community Fund. We do it every year the gala's held here." Victoria said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I only mention it," Marcus continued, "because I think caliber is a strange thing to measure by a person's clothes. The man who fixed that flickering light last night has been maintaining buildings in this city for almost 30 years. He's put 2 kids through college doing it. He knows more about keeping people safe in high-rises than most engineers I've hired with fancy degrees." He closed the folio gently. "I'd hate for anyone signing a 10-year lease in my building to think that's the kind of caliber we measure people by here." Preston's face had gone the color of old paper. "Mr. Webb, I promise you, that's not how I believe you, Mr. Hayes," Marcus said, and for the first time, there was something almost kind in his voice. "I've reviewed your firm's record. Hayes Capital treats its own employees well from what I can tell. Good benefits, low turnover. That matters to me. It's actually the reason I moved this meeting up. I wanted to meet the people behind the paperwork before I signed off." He glanced, briefly, at Victoria. "I just wanted everyone in the room to understand exactly who they were dealing with." On both sides, the meeting continued for another 40 minutes, and by every professional measure, it went well. Marcus asked sharp, informed questions about Hayes Capital's 5-year growth projections, about their sublease intentions, about how they plan to use the additional floors. Preston, visibly rattled at first, recovered his footing as the conversation shifted into more familiar territory numbers. Contracts, timelines, and by the end, Marcus extended his hand across the table. "I think this is a good fit," he said. "Diane will finalize the paperwork this week." "Welcome to Ashford Tower, Mr. Hayes." "Thank you," Preston said, shaking his hand with visible relief. "Truly, thank you." Victoria had not said a single word in over half an hour. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the grain of the glass table as though it might offer an escape route. As the room began to empty, lawyers gathering folders, Diane packing up her laptop, Marcus paused at the door and turned back. "Mrs. Hayes," she looked up, bracing herself. "For what it's worth," Marcus said, "I don't hold grudges over hallway conversations. People say things they regret, especially at parties, especially after champagne. I've certainly said my share." He offered the faintest suggestion of a smile. "But I'd ask you to remember something the next time you're in one of my buildings, or anyone's building, really. The person emptying your trash, fixing your lights, or holding the elevator door might be having a very different night than the one you assume. You never really know who you're talking to." He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded once to Preston, thanked Diane, and walked out, leaving Victoria alone at the glass table with the ruins of a croissant and the wreckage of her own certainty. The story, of course, did not stay contained to the 47th floor. By that afternoon, 3 separate versions of what had happened in the conference room had made their way through Hayes Capital's office gossip channels, each slightly more dramatic than the last. By evening, one of the paralegals who'd witnessed the tail end of the meeting had mentioned it to her sister, who happened to work events for the Hartwell Foundation, and within 48 hours, an anonymized but unmistakable version of the story was circulating through the same social circles that had laughed at Marcus in the hallway 2 nights before. Did you hear about the woman who insulted the janitor at the Ashford Gala? Turns out, he owns the whole tower. Victoria heard it repeated back to her exactly once, at a luncheon the following week, by a woman who clearly had no idea she was speaking to the subject of the story. Victoria smiled thinly, excused herself to the restroom, and did not attend another gala at Ashford Tower for the rest of the year. Preston, for his part, handled the fallout with the practiced diplomacy of a man used to smoothing over his wife's occasional missteps. He sent Marcus a handwritten note the following week, not an email, a note, on actual paper thanking him again for his patience and reaffirming Hayes Capital's commitment to being good tenants. Marcus appreciated the gesture more than he let on. It told him something about the kind of man Preston was, separate from the kind of woman his wife had chosen to be that night. He never brought it up with Victoria directly again. He didn't need to. Some lessons, once learned in front of an audience, tend to stay learned. 3 months later, Marcus found himself back on the 49th floor of Ashford Tower, this time in his charcoal suit, walking through as the building's owner rather than its disguise. He'd come to check on the new fixture in the east hallway, a habit he'd developed since that night, an odd little ritual of returning to the scene. He ran into Preston Hayes near the elevator bank, briefcase in hand, clearly heading home for the evening. "Mr. Webb," Preston said, extending a hand. "Good to see you. Everything working out with the new floors?" "Better than expected," Marcus said. "Your team's been a pleasure to have in the building." Preston hesitated, then added, a little awkwardly, "Victoria's been different since that meeting. Quieter about certain things. I think it rattled her more than she'd ever admit." He shifted his briefcase to his other hand. "For what it's worth, I think it was good for her. Not the way I'd have chosen for it to happen, but good." Marcus considered that for a moment. "People don't usually change because someone tells them to," he said. "They change when the story they've been telling themselves about who they are stops matching what actually happens to them." Preston nodded slowly, as though turning the thought over, and the 2 men rode down together in silence, the city lights beginning to flicker on below them through the elevator's glass wall, millions of small lives, unseen and unassuming, holding up the glittering towers that people like Victoria Sinclair-Hayes so rarely thought to look at twice. Marcus stepped out into the lobby, nodded to the night security guard by name, and walked out into the cold evening air, just another man in a good suit, disappearing into a city full of people whose worth had nothing to do with what they wore, and everything to do with who they chose to be when they thought no one important was watching. The end.